Good evening and welcome. My name is Barry Singer, and I'm the proprietor of the bookseller on the premises. Tonight we present, as part of our first readings at Chartwell Booksellers series, a work of nonfiction, the autobiography of Father Daniel Berrigan, To Dwell in Peace. Let me explain just for those of you, and I think there are many of you out there who are here for the first time, this is a series that we conceived as a fanfare for new fiction. The idea was and is to generally promote new works of fiction that otherwise might not get the attention that they merit by pairing every other month or so a new novel or short story collection with a guest reader in a dramatic evening here at the store. And that series is now 2 years old, actually, this month, and has worked quite beautifully. We've presented new writing by such authors as Jane Ann Phillips, Bobby Ann Mason, Scott Spencer, Alice McDermott, and a stellar group of guest readers that have included Elizabeth McGovern and Judd Nelson, Kate Nelligan, Brooke Adams, a number of others. We were so encouraged, in fact, by the response that we got for a fanfare for new fiction that we decided to take a shot at nonfiction. We did that late last year for the first time with a book called Storming the Magic Kingdom, which was a very, very riveting, quite dramatic account of an attempted takeover attempt some years ago by the corporate raider Saul Steinberg of Walt Disney Productions. For our guest readers, we invited some of the businessmen involved in the book, some of the major players in that book, to read themselves, and that worked quite beautifully also. It encouraged us to try other nonfiction first readings, and here we are tonight presenting Father Berrigan's To Dwell in Peace. Our guest readers are, firstly, Father Daniel Berrigan, the author, who is probably best known to the world, I realize, for his activism throughout the 60s against the Vietnam War. He has continued to this day to pursue his own very extraordinary, very personal campaign for peace, championing many, many different causes. He's an activist to this very moment. We're waiting for them Mr. Sheen and Father Berrigan to arrive from a hospice in Harlem. Am I correct? For the homeless. His book is an extraordinary document. It's sort of a combination of a private meditation and a manifesto, a call to action. We're very privileged to be able to present it here this evening. I'm very privileged and proud to have you here with us tonight. Reading with Father Berrigan are Mr. Martin Sheen and Mr. Edward Hermann. I don't think I have to say too much about either gentleman. They are two of our very finest actors. Mr. Sheen comes to us tonight direct from the Slammer, I understand. I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but Mr. Sheen was arrested just this past Friday, again.
That was all in the past.
All in the past. For participating in a civil disobedience, a demonstration for peace near the UN. We're delighted that you were able to make it tonight, and thank you for coming. Mr. Edward Hermann has no prison record that I know of, but I think I hear he's a very nice guy.
We'll change all that.
And he is also, his acting credentials are impeccable, as I'm sure you all know. I give you then Mr. Edward Hermann, Mr. Martin Sheen, Father Daniel Berrigan, To Dwell in Peace.
An opening statement and maybe a moment of silence.
The evening tonight has particular resonance for all of us here, from the back row to here, being the anniversary of the death of Dr. Martin Luther King. And we would like, if you would agree, to dedicate the evening to Dr. King's memory and to his lasting work, which must go on if we are to redeem ourselves. So we would like to begin the evening with just a minute or so of silence in Dr. King's memory. Amen.
Amen. The family was poor, but poverty, whether in Minnesota or later in New York State, was a strictly relative term and mitigated in many ways. There was pride and life on the land and food, homegrown and sensibly prepared. The clothing was imaginative, hand-me-downs for the younger fry, the older ones making do with gifts from adults, relatives, cut and sewn more or less to size.
My mother was past mistress of the art of improvisation. If our Sunday lineup resembled that of the Victorian Cratchits, an unmatched sock here and sleeves to spare, why, the result was artful and decent and clean, and she was content if the children were not. And my father. One had best begin here a fretful topic, and to the present day by no means satisfactory. He compounded in one life the ironies and contradictions that are said to compose the Irish character. There was something Dickensian about him, if it be understood that his rightful image can by no means be reduced to humbug or caricature. Poverty, he was wont to declare histrionically, was his plain choice in life. But the choice was in way of default of choice. He went from job to job and performed a variety of work honorably and well. But the years passed and the jobs went nowhere. He was railroad engineer and fireman, batched it in the woods of northern Canada, worked in the Ford auto factory in Detroit, grew wheat in Saskatchewan. In later years, he would labor for the Electrical Corporation in upstate New York and farm a patch of land in the small way of a renter. All, or nearly all, to no avail, or to as little avail as, with the patient collusion of my mother, would be euphemistically referred to as a living. In the Minnesota years and later, he was absent from the household for long periods, seeking work on the railroad. Sometimes he found it, sometimes not. Actually, he was part of a vulnerable labor force at the mercy of the economy. He was master of several skills, but none of them, in a time of recession, was considered, quotes, marketable.
We were born into a nest woven of a skein of contradictions, contrived by his workman's hands. Of all his convoluted ways, perhaps this was the most remarkable: his ability to live a life that was an enigma to those closest to him. This way and that he wove his life and ours around him. His character would make of that life by neglect and industry, by violence and tenderness, by virtuous word and singularly unvirtuous conduct, by yelling and weeping and pieties and cruelties and inexplicable uxorious moods, by anger and obscenity and embraces and tears, an extraordinary conglomerate of passion and illusion. A world he constructed despite all evidence of the real world. And then the shovings about, the commands to walk that world of his.
I am convinced he was an enigma to himself. His soul, a lake of unpredictable storm, was a darkness before his own eyes. Confronted with the bleak sanity of my mother, he reacted in a fury. She was offensive. She walked another planet of whose terrain he was utterly ignorant. Were other families making do, or prospering, or going under, raising children in ways at variance with his own? And might such families provide clues? He blazed up, furious, dangerous. It was a fury of incomprehension and pride. Early on, we grew inured as the price of survival to violence as a norm of existence. I remember as my eyes opened to the lives of neighbors, my astonishment at seeing that wives and husbands were not natural enemies. What a puzzlement, novelty it was, that affection might be thought to exist between spouses and parents.
He was willful and innocent and self-centered, an incendiary without a cause. He knew nothing of the world and its ways, and he fancied he knew them through and through. Hence his and ours vertiginous lives, teetering on the edge of America. His hands remained empty, even as his restlessness kept him on the move.
He kept at nothing, and then the desperate crash of 29 occurred, and he was reduced to a, quote, welfare job at a slave's wage.
He ground his teeth and vented his anger on his family. Our slightest peccadillo and all hell broke loose. I sit in slack harness at 66 years. A smile breaks on a phiz the child would hardly know for his own. Wrinkles and ruts aplenty, the plowing of the garden of experience. Do you remember, I asked the child, the year you started to breathe? He is puzzled momentarily, but he takes my meaning. I do, he answered, and his grin matches my own.
Do you recall the face of that nun?
Of course. She was beautiful, not in the way of convention, but of suffering, dignity, self-possession.
Why this talk of a great light?
Because it was the first time in my cursed desert, the first time I encountered a teacher who was also a human being.
Remember how long those years and how deadly?
I think I do. I think you know I do. I think you recall, moreover, that those were by no means the last time someone fastened on a mask of cruelty and terror and boredom and ego and threat and wrote, and then straight-faced announced that education was underway.
Indeed. But we were talking about 1 month in a child's autumn.
I knew in my mother a woman of grace and even-handed love, but I had known no other like her. And the question rises in me whether one such as she is sufficient, especially when one's life is delivered over for months and years into the hands of drones, wasps, jellyfish, and now and then a certified scorpion. To each and all of whom, if it can be credited, someone, something has unaccountably conferred a name of moment and dignity and responsibility: teacher.
It took no time at all, that apotheosis. There was no warning.
On that first day she came briskly into the room. She had piercing black eyes that held nothing but kindness in their depths, largeness, scope. She stood there and surveyed us, and a smile broke on her face and ours. We knew at that moment that we were well received, that the year ahead would be a good one. She would take us at our word, at our conduct, beginning from that hour, and her expectation was a simple one, that her knowledgeable good sense would draw the best from us, would also draw the worst from us, like a healing purge. It came to this: I wanted to learn after all. That was the light she kindled. I had not known how desperately I wanted to learn. The hunger was buried deep under layers of frustration and contempt. I had become used to half a life of little account. I was reputed a nonentity in the official ledgers, where jot and tittle were the rule, and the juices of life ran in a ditch. What a darkness I was to myself.
A few teachers stand out in memory, not because any was unusually endowed, but each in her own way had a generous sense of the human, a measure of simpatico for youthful flagrancies and foibles, and each was able to give a nudge at the right moment to a glimmer of ambition or talent.
And of one it can be said in all simplicity that but for her, I would never have dreamed of knocking at the portals of the mighty fortress of Jesuitry.
She was a teacher of French, which she spoke and wrote elegantly. Holiness dwelt in the sweetness of her smile, her radiance, the patience with which, in spite of ill health, she shepherded her recusant flock into pastures new. Among the saints she loved Joan of Arc, whom perhaps she resembled.
For reasons that remain obscure to this day, she spotted me for a priest. Me, I squirmed and dodged. She played the line with patience, and one day the bait was taken.
She was mistress of an old method, and in those days an honored one. And I am not at all certain that it is dead today, or dishonored by later experience. It went this way. Quote, promising candidates were regularly hailed into the convent parlor, there to be interrogated as their works and pomps, their prayers and social habits. The first of such interviews might open with a question whether one had seriously considered the priesthood or convent. If so, he or she was enjoined to continue by hallowed means to seek out further light on the, quote, will of God. If not, why not? Serious counsel was given to ponder whether this awesome step might not represent the sovereign will. To be so summoned was momentous. It marked one as part of a select company. We were enjoined to receive communion frequently, to open the question of our future to a trusted confessor, and to report with regularity as to progress or pitfalls.
My closest friend, a classmate, was also singled out for this practical attention. Thus matters deepened. From now, two would be in quest of the Grail side by side. I watched and waited, and was touched by an obscure sense, sometimes disturbing, of being blessed in a way I had hardly chosen. Which orders would take us? Presuming, of course, that we were considered worth the taking. Or better still, in our magnificent insouciance, which orders would we choose? Presuming, of course, that any order in its right mind would fairly leap at his or my offer. We went round and round, abetted by our nun, that believer in unicorns.
The truth must be told of this holy conniver. She presented herself in the guise of a simple adjutant, a meek surveyor of the Lord's harvest field, meek as a Valkyrie. She had determined on an outcome. The Jesuits alone would do.
We suspected nothing of this, how the game was loaded. We wrote letters, each of us choosing 4 seminaries requesting information, and then received our answers. From several, there arrived a rather intense come-on. Snazzy illustrated booklets, full colors, photos of premises splendid and forbidding, seaside property, lake property, country property, tennis courts, swimming pools. Come, be sanctified, be all-American with us.
Everything was easy, natural, miles of smiles, the ecclesiastical escalator to utopia. In any case, to tasks in foreign missions or classrooms or laboratories or hospitals or prisons or the military. In retrospect, whether the garb be donned was black or brown or white, how unabashed and American it all seemed.
We too exchanged our packets as they arrived. We pondered and kept each to his counsel. Like the shepherds in the autumn poem, we were simply waiting, and for we knew not what. Then there arrived, tardily as I recalled, yet another response, whether addressed to my friend or myself.
It was an envelope so plain as to qualify as possibly containing obscene material. The material was sent by the Jesuits.
Neither of us had laid mortal eyes on the Jesuit. My father's bookcase included a formidable set of 5 livid green volumes entitled Pioneer Priests of North America. The author was a Jesuit historian, Campbell by name. I had labored through the series. They recounted in some details the lives and exploits of Fathers Isaac Jogues, Jean de Brébeuf, Jean de Lalande, de Smet, Marquette, and other explorers and missioners of the continent. I was awed and set to thinking.
Then arrived this booklet in the mail. No hype, no photos, no come-on. Its chastening photographs turned, so to speak, an impassive, cultivated face, not in our direction precisely, more in profile, as though an ear were attentive, but the concentration were elsewhere.
The tone of the writing was as fascinating and warm of heart as, say, a railway timetable. We could take this train or that, or none at all. It was all the same to the conductor. While we were deciding, there were other passengers to be attended to. We could, if so minded, apply for a ticket, which would be processed in due time.
The booklet outlined the course of Jesuit training year by year. You were sent here or there, you studied, you were taught, you taught others, you prayed, you studied some more, and then some more. In matter of longevity, if you proposed finishing the course, you had best be a direct descendant of Methuselah. At approximately double your present age, and presuming you survived the run, you would be ready. Whether for death or the labors assigned was left unstated.
Behold the pertinacity of the young. We were fascinated. In our hands lay a far different proposal, a non-proposal. A message dropped with studied carelessness by the way, and in its chanciness perhaps even a summons. Mysterious, impersonal as a blank check. The message, a scrutiny that spared nothing, excellence with no holds barred. Don't phone us. We perhaps will phone you. We had agreed on a ground rule. The two of us were each to come to a decision separately, and only then to confide it to the other. So we passed a week or two absorbing the small gray print of the halfpenny screed, gray on gray, an intractable tract for the times.
It was to be the Jesuits, for both, separately as to the search, then corporately for a lifetime. Understatement had won, an indirection, and the slightest tug on the line.
Finally, in June of 1952, amid considerable wonderment and rejoicing, I was ordained. The event was accounted at the time as a grace, and still is. Numerous photos were taken on that day of days, whose high drama time both caught and caught up with, and eventually rendered both quaint and inviolable.
For all that was to follow and threaten and undermine, the anointing of ordination was a momentous healing and enlightenment. It justified the long haul and its sweat and tears. It struck a light that has never been extinguished.
The healer and lighter of lamps that day was the then Archbishop of Boston, Richard Cushing. He performed the ordination at a tornado pace and pitch. Each of us caught up. When his great bassoon sounded announcing this or that stage of the proceeding, one could entertain no least doubt that the gift offered was in fact being conferred. The chariot swung low and swept one up, and I had at last become what I was called to be. The Archbishop was in all respects the ideal agent of a transfigured moment. He brought dignity and coherence and validity on the day, a day awaited and worked toward for 13 years, and with what trepidation. Cushing stiffened our wavering spines and watery knees by the fierce thrust of his own resolve. At the altar he conveyed a relentless, rugged faith, the faith of a medieval bishop perhaps, not only a spiritual shepherd, but the ruler of some vast, untamed fiefdom, as indeed Cushing was in the Boston of the Curleys and the Irish tribes. I was a priest at last. It was year one of my life, or the first day of a new creation, I knew not which, nor cared greatly. I went out into the sunshine, blinking with the wonder of it all, to greet and bless my family. Another year of studies followed.
An old priest, not of the order, once said to me, "There are Jesuits and Jesuits, good and bad." He remembers being offended by the sentence. At the same time, he was given pause by its source, a good priest, outside envy or advantage. And for all the Jesuit could tell, the judgment was offered in a good spirit. How much he had to learn. 40 years later, he has not learned much, especially in regard to what is known as the Jesuit thing. And even when he thinks to come close, he knows that he has described nothing more remarkable than the common calling of Christians.
An ex-member of the order, a scholar of some renown, even of dark renown, referred to the Jesuits as an enigma. a word that implies a taint, as of secrets artful and even duplicitous. There are indeed enigmas in the world, and enigmatic persons, and closed doors, and power broking, and contempt for others, and recourse to violence. No one endowed with even a primitive sense of the century needs instructions in such matters.
The world appears to me as morally enigmatic. Its secrecy, lying, violence, and lust for power renders hearts and institutions opaque, resistant against scrutiny and confession and accountability. This is the world as enigma. It does not know itself. Generation after generation, it clones its own methods. It resists that change we name change of heart or conversion, whether in leadership or institutions. But the believing community is another matter entirely. Its image and ideal is Christ. Crystalline clarity, forthrightness, direct speech, moral leverage, sacrifice, cohesion of word and act. So, it seems to me, is our calling. It comes to this, I believe. The Jesuits are an enigma only in the degree that we fall victim to worldly ways, that we allow ourselves to be pelted with that filth that goes by the name of, quotes, riches, honors, the credit of a great name. As indeed our founding saint solemnly warned, he having been cleansed by the might and mercy of God of this miasma.
The temptation remains, if not always accountability.
It takes the form, I believe, of pride of place, that siren of the celibate and professional. It was the late 50s. I was becoming known here and there through my books, was teaching, leading retreats, lecturing, offering poetry readings, working like a demon, and loving it. I was accounted stern in the classroom, and not solely regarding points of scripture. When assignments were due, I poked about in corners of grammar, punctuation, with a fine-pointed stick indeed. I sought literacy as well as imagination. My image in those days is of a devoted dray horse in harness. Students must arrive similarly geared for plow and furrow. My peers and I had an influence that went beyond formalities. We were quasi-gurus of the college. We walked in light. We also kept a weather eye out for the best students and beckoned them into our life. So there developed around us a group known as the Sodality. The members underwent a spiritual discipline of sacrament, prayer, and social action. They also regularly reported to a priest director who was monitor, curb, and spur, perhaps most important, a good listener. Thus our influence grew, and so did the opposition, something, after all, to be expected. We were handling volatile materials, even inducing a flashpoint in young lives. Students graduated and were encouraged to continue in the communal discipline they had undertaken in college. Young professionals, a wider horizon. Together we began to scrutinize the urban structures, the housing, the banking, and investments. What we found could be described as a species of unsavory chic, an old story, but new to us.
The local Catholic establishment, that is to say, had a large hand in the trough named real estate. They fed exceedingly well there, and in proportion as the arrangement worked well for them, outside scrutiny was discouraged. Neat dovetailing was the well-kept secret as we studied the city and its power brokers. Each of them owned a bit of everything. Each was rich, but no one was ostentatiously rich. A bit here, quite a large bit, a bit there, real estate shares, banking shares, manufacturing shares, media shares. The same faces appeared on corporate boards. A vote here, a vote there. It added up to enormous power, judiciously parceled out. Maximum benefits, concealed accountability. The gentleman who owned Syracuse owned, one by one, only parts of Syracuse. Putting the parts together was our task, and it was devilishly hard.
Who was accountably saved for an uninhabitable derelict dwelling, a crowded slum block? Who collected rents and refused to make repairs? Or who, after a disastrous fire following all manner of violations, was indictable for loss of life?
These were the questions we tackled. In the breach as it happened, because Syracuse, like any city one might mention across the land, was pocked with shanties, that on winter nights went up like torches.
We were on touchy ground. The monetary mandarins were influential not only in the political establishment but in the church as well. They oiled the gears of the city. They were also conspicuous consumers of parish services. More, and for us, worse, they were among the founding geniuses of the Jesuit college.
So the question seethed away. Should these venerables be subject to scrutiny, nay, to legal challenge, and this in face of their largee to Lemoyne College? Talk about conflict of interest.
I felt in my discouragement that the conflict ran so deep as to be beyond resolution. Institutions versus conscience, college versus public interest. Or more precisely, the college versus the rights of the poor to bare survival. And now, a professor at the college and a Jesuit to boot, encouraging graduates against the best and vested interests to undermine, even to topple its deep-set pillars. The drama continues, the drama is unresolved. The Jesuits are not the first to undertake a sacred work with highly charged secular tactics. The old monasteries had been founded by kings and princes, open-handed with their often ill-gotten goods and insurance against judgment. I was feeling the brutal force of the dilemma, even in the act of heightening it. It occurred to me that I could continue such work only by separating out from the college community entirely, dwelling downtown among the poor. I did not do so. Another way opened before me. The Vietnam War was to turn my life around. I recall the phrase of Chesterton. After his baptism, he said, it was as though he stood on his head in the world. Everything rational and conclusive had gone upside down. The war turned me upside down, my family also. Upside down, our pockets turned out, possessions and honors and the credit of a good name, routine, soutane, long black line, institutional life, all suppositions of geography and soul. All things normally to be thought of as up or as down, tossed upside down.
Yet the war was normal in the common estimate of Catholics and Jesuits, as normal as any war in our past, and it tripped us up. What was thought of as normal violence and normal killing and normal mitigations, these, once rejected by my brother and myself, became among Catholics an occasion of outcry and indignation. What right have they, those disgraceful priests? The courts and jails, off limits to decent folk like ourselves, mere phantasmagoria at the back of the mind, or at most places one visited from time to time as supporter or counselor of others, these turned about giddily in the whirlwind, that their doors swung wide, and we, turned about, were tumbled into their maw, to be judged, found guilty, locked up.
And repeatedly there was a jostling of a much more venerable kind. We fell out of favor with the church. We were scrutinized and weighed and found wanting in respect for authority or obedience to marching orders or silencing orders or orders about good order. In any case, convicted, invariably in camera, and summarily sent packing from one city to another.
It came to this, as far as one could judge in those tumultuous times. Violence was the norm. The war was the norm. The times, the bloodletting, these were normal. These always regrettable incidents were the responsibility of no one in particular. What was one to do? What was a president to do, or a bishop, or any citizen? Alas, war was a very old story, and this one must be seen through to the end.
Normal meant morally acceptable.
What was abnormal, morally unacceptable, was ourselves. Nonviolence. One superior in the Jesuits said, "What you and your friends do is of course allowable and even laudable among Christians, but it has no place among Jesuits."
Philip arrived at Cornell, where I had been teaching sometime in the late summer of '67. There was a plan afoot. He wanted me informed of it, not precisely to induct me into the action, I think he sensed how far I was from being a ready candidate for something so audacious as he purposed.
The plan came to this. He and a few cohorts would enter a draft board in downtown Baltimore and pour their own blood on the files contained in the building. They would then wait quietly, abiding by their act and its consequence.
It was all quite simple. It was also unprecedented, calculated to set the head spinning.
But the head on my shoulders was not so much set spinning as further stuck in place. I was shaken to the core by the venture. I was by no means convinced on the spot or won over even as a friend in court, much less as a participant. Where was I then? I saw myself as walking one bit of turf and he another. But our paths were by no means crossing, nor were he and I walking parallel lines. I wrote him after his visit and its revelation to the tune that, quote, I continued to see my work as standing by the students in their travail, nothing more.
He responded with considerable impatience. It developed that he had no approval to spare for the Boston defendants whose trial had recently finished. The four celebrated defendants, he thought, were merely reacting to the government rather than confronting it. Their conduct during the trial was consistent with reaction. They were bound to buckle under by dint of legal stratagems. Philip's instinct, on the other hand, was to seek out an occasion at his own time and place, take the offensive, and force the government to respond.
He had come on a way to do this, a moral assault on purportedly sacrosanct territory, an act he insisted very much in the spirit of King and Gandhi, but as tactic, something utterly new, something, as he must have known, bound to raise towering waves, to erupt in controversy, denunciation, passionate pros and cons, even spite and scorn.
The proposed act was entirely in line with his temperament. His life had been a steady rhythm of improvisation and discipline. He was a surprising spirit. He dug deep and came up with directions, modes, arguments, light in dark places. And equally of import, he had a capacity to beckon others along. He made virtue attractive. In his presence, as I saw time and again, less hardy spirits such as myself breathed deep and stepped out.
That action of the Baltimore Four, as things evolved, proved not only a watershed moment in the anti-war community, it was also a reshuffling of the Catholic cards. That holy terror deck stacked to the elbows with assured salvation and no losers. Did not every one of us hold a winning hand?
In November of '67, I traveled to Washington to support friends from the university, Cornell, and elsewhere who were planning to surround the Pentagon. Support was all I was ready for, or so I thought, misjudging in my ignorance the shove of moral pressure, more especially the pressure engendered by perils descending on my friends. It was my first such demonstration. Indeed, nothing had prepared me for the spectacle of the Pentagon, the awesome pile of utterly characterless masonry, pretentious as a pharaoh's tomb and as morally void. It was also the first mesmerizing sight of a great throng pressing against the river entrance, sitting, standing, singing, praying, exhorting, spilling upward like a water-defying gravity, up the lawn, up the steps, in face of the massed soldiery.
It was almost as though one species of creation were confronting another. On the one hand, improvisation, color, variety of clothing and hair and bodily gesture. And on the other, the human remolded, set in place, predefined, all but predigested. The uniforms not only clothed the frames, they veiled the eyes, silenced the tongues. The young soldiers were, by pentagonal definition, the complete humans born from Holy Mother State. Complete, they confronted the incomplete, the gunless hordes of the unviolent, those who could not, or worse, would not discharge a gun.
Evening approached. The massed floodlights were lit. We stood or sat or knelt in the glare of public knowledge and legal jeopardy. Eventually it was announced with a great blare that, quote, at midnight the law will take effect. All who remain in place are liable then to arrest.
My friends, of course, chose to remain, and so by force of example did I. Again and again in the heady Cornell days we had applied to one another the word friend. It seemed fitting that the word be tested here, in a place where presumably only weapons were to be tested, or humans it might be, but only insofar as these were useful appendages to the weapons, accessory, and after the fact, so to speak.
Buses were at hand out there in the rim of the darkness. It was no great task for the military to move in and carry or lead us away.
We were brought to a disused military camp in Virginia. There, for a matter of some days, we were treated somewhat like wayward children in summer camp, temporarily restrained because of minor infractions. Then one day, out of the blue, a squad of legal skulls descended on us. It was the first time, but by no means the last time, that a fairly close community was disrupted by lawyers, dangling before the eyes of innocents the fast food of the culture. Quick in, quick out, no questions asked. The purveyors were wreckers of community, which in this case was tentative indeed in its first stages, and extremely vulnerable to the dangling carrot, walking free. Most of the formerly fervent seized the bait and departed on the instant. The remaining, who might be judged arbitrary spirits, requested a trial. They were thereupon judged apt to benefit from a lesson.
We had begun an improvised fast, a way we thought drawn from civil rights experience of gaining a modicum of clarity. There came a moment of clarity indeed, the moment when the children's camp's days were over. We survivors of the legal eagles were placed in holding cells to await transport to the D.C. jail. There, during a waiting period, I was visited by a young priest, the chaplain. He had been flown in from Fort Benning along with transport guards, part of the standard government equipment. He leaned negligently against the bars of my cell and grinned into my face for all the world like a delighted child at a zoo. And all the while he was copiously refreshing himself from a container of orange juice. Hardly worth attention, the episode was yet instructive. I remember the priest, the moment I saw, perhaps for the first time, hilarious symbols. The priest in concert, the priest in contest. The strange crossing over that occur. Priests of the state, priests against the state.
We were taken off to Washington in cuffs and chains, and there segregated from the prison populace in our own dormitory. From thence we were led 3 times daily, after regular meal service, to a cafeteria area. A great rumble arose about our daring a fast. Such deviations would not be allowed. We were risking being force-fed, etc., none of which dire contingencies occurred. The fast continued, and within a week or so, we were released.
A friend in the Washington area was waiting to transport me to a Catholic worker house nearby, where I was fortified by a bowl of soup, and so in short order regained my land legs.
But it was in the car en route that we heard the news. The daring do of the Baltimore Four, the draft board raid, the successful pouring of blood on the files, and the summary arrests.
It was a curious juxtaposition. I had taken part in a kind of low-intensity act together with those who shortly thereafter would vanish once more into the tunnels and byways of college routine.
But when Philip and his friends walked through the door of the draft board, there was no exit, not for years. They were seized by the great Caesar. They were trespassers on his turf, had dared muck up the exquisite order of his necrophiliac files, where the names of the soon-to-be killed or the soon-to-kill or both were preserved against the great day of summons.
The files stood for all sorts of things best left in shadowy dossiers rather than brought into the light. For all the world, as we were later to see in Catonsville, the files in their drawers reminded one of a vast morgue, the corpses of lives not quite interred. There a young person could legally enter, open the file, read his fate before the fact. The files legalized his own death, legalized also the deaths of others who might fall prey to his rifle. First and foremost, the files bore witness to the absolute inviolability of legalized violence. The files were, as we were to describe them later, hunting licenses against humans. They declared an open season against the living by the living.
My, quotes, Cornell conclusion, for what it was worth, not much, still stood firm. It stood hardly weakened by the exemplary action of the Baltimore Four. To wit, we, the good anti-war clergy, had gone as far as could be. We had counseled the young in their quest for a peaceable kingdom. We have even approached law-breaking and conspiracy in our support of campus ministers who renounced their draft cards. We had not yet come on the moral equivalent of the resistors. We were far removed from their legal risks. How is an impasse broken? Only, I think, by a startling discovery and epiphany, a dawning. Only this could reveal my ignorance for what it was. Short of it, in the Socratic sense, I did not know that I knew next to nothing. Into our sublime, serene island, Cornell, our El Dorado, came Philip once again. He is not to be thought of as a portent, nothing so pretentious. He was a friend, and he came bearing a gift.
Such a gift as stops the heart short. He and others, he stated simply, were not content that the action at Baltimore Draft Center should rest there, a flash in the pan, a gesture, for it was more than that, and government leniency or sternness in the coming trial must not steal the thunder of the peaceable.
The action, in short, must be repeated elsewhere, and he for one and Tom Lewis for another were prepared to repeat it in Catonsville, Maryland.
Would I join them? Well, would I? The idea was immensely attractive. It was also a shocker. But it was less frightening than it would have been months before. I was freshly returned from Hanoi, where I had cowered under American bombing. That helped wonderfully to clear the mind. I told Philip I would give the proposal 24 hours, monitoring meantime the course of emotion and mood. And if my purpose held for that period, I was in. Which in due time I was, up to my chin. A sense then, as I recall, of immense freedom, as though in choosing I could now breathe deep and call my life my own.
A sense also of the end of a road or a fork or a sudden turn, and no telling what lay ahead or beyond. At the same time, a certainty deeper than logic. What lay behind was best placed behind, once and for all, and no looking back.
The night before that fateful May morning, we assembled at a friend's house and made a rite, preparing the napalm. Kerosene and soap chips, a simple formula out of a Green Beret handbook, ignited the hell.
Next morning, with fast-beating hearts, we drove to Catonsville. The draft board was on the second floor of a tacky frame building above an office of the Knights of Columbus.
On Catholic grounds. We entered armed with our resolve and symbol, the container of home-brewed napalm.
We reassured as best we might the transfixed employees.